The syringe trembled in Dr. Rebecca Hayes's hand, 3 milliliters of pentobarbital gleaming like liquid death under the harsh fluorescent lights. The German shepherd lay strapped to the cold steel table, amber eyes staring at nothing, resigned to his fate after 6 months of rejection and fear. The clinic door exploded open. A blind man stumbled through, white cane clattering to the floor, his face a mask of desperate recognition. "Thunder!" The single word cut through the sterile air like a battle cry. The dog's massive head snapped up, ears pricking forward for the first time in months. Tears, actual tears, spilled from those amber eyes as a sound escaped his throat. Not quite a whine, not quite a howl, but something ancient and heartbroken and hopeful all at once. Dr. Hayes dropped the syringe, the glass shattering against the floor in a symphony of destruction. How could a blind man who claimed no memory recognize a condemned dog he'd never met? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 days earlier, the autumn morning mist clung to Hope Valley like a shroud, the golden aspens whispering secrets only the mountains could keep. Nestled between snow-capped peaks and rolling meadows, the small Colorado town of 2,847 souls had always been a place where broken things came to heal, or to die quietly. Margaret Maggie Chen Wilson stood at the kitchen window of Second Chance's Animal Sanctuary, her weathered hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug that read "World's Best Mom." At 67, she carried the weight of too many goodbyes in her silver hair and the stubborn hope of a woman who'd buried a husband and son but refused to surrender her faith. The foreclosure notice lay unopened on the counter behind her, its red lettering bleeding through the envelope like an accusation. "Well, I'll be hornswoggled," she muttered, watching a lone figure make his way up the gravel drive. The man moved with the careful precision of someone navigating a world he couldn't see, his white cane tapping a rhythm against the stones. Something about his posture, shoulders squared despite his obvious exhaustion, chin lifted as if still facing an invisible enemy, reminded her of Harold when he'd come home from Vietnam. Michael Sterling paused at the sanctuary's gate, his 32 years etched in premature lines around sightless blue eyes. The faded Marine Corps t-shirt hung loose on his lean frame, and his jeans were worn thin at the knees. He lived 40 miles away in a rusted trailer, surviving on $847 a month in disability payments. But something had driven him here through 3 bus transfers and a thunderstorm that had soaked him to the bone. Behind the main building, in the isolation kennel where the dangerous animals waited for their final judgment, Thunder lay motionless on a bed of donated blankets. The 7-year-old German Shepherd had once been the pride of Unit 47 military police, his black and tan coat gleaming with purpose, his amber eyes alert and intelligent. Now those same eyes held nothing but resignation. A jagged scar ran from his left ear to his muzzle, a souvenir from Syria that would never fully heal. He hadn't eaten in 4 days. Dr. Rebecca Hayes emerged from the clinic, her veterinary coat stained with the honest work of someone who fought death daily and lost more often than she won. At 29, she carried $70,000 in student debt and the crushing idealism of someone who still believed every life could be saved. Her grandfather's Purple Heart hung in a frame above her desk, a reminder that some sacrifices were worth making. The town itself bore the quiet dignity of a place that understood loss. Main Street held 3 churches, 2 diners, and a single traffic light that had blinked yellow for 15 years. Veterans outnumbered civilians 2 to 1, and everyone knew someone who hadn't come home. It was the kind of place where strangers became family, and family never truly left, even when the government declared them dead. The spark that would change everything arrived in a manila envelope marked "Final Notice" and a phone call that shattered the morning quiet like breaking glass. Maggie stood in her kitchen, the foreclosure papers trembling in her arthritic hands as County Animal Control Officer Brad Kowalski delivered his verdict over a crackling phone line. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm sorry, but Thunder failed his final behavioral assessment. 3 handlers, 3 separate incidents. We can't risk public safety any longer." His voice carried the weariness of a man who'd signed too many death warrants. "You have 72 hours to comply with the termination order." Maggie sank into Harold's old recliner, the leather cracked and faded, but still holding the ghost of his aftershave. $50,000 in debt, the sanctuary hemorrhaging money faster than she could count, and now this. The irony wasn't lost on her. On the same day she might lose her home, she was ordered to take the life of a creature who'd already lost everything that mattered. Thunder lay in Kennel 12, the isolation unit reserved for animals deemed beyond redemption. His massive frame filled barely half the concrete space, but he made himself smaller still, curled into a tight ball with his scarred muzzle tucked beneath his tail. The untouched food bowl mocked both of them. 4 days without eating, and his ribs were beginning to show through his dull coat. The other dogs had learned to give him space. Even Rex, the pit bull mix who'd been rescued from a fighting ring, whined softly when Thunder's nightmares made him pace the small enclosure at 3 in the morning. It was as if they understood that some wounds cut too deep for even canine companionship to heal. When the Channel 7 news van pulled into the sanctuary parking lot, Maggie's first instinct was to hide. But reporter Jennifer Walsh had kind eyes and a grandfather who'd served in Korea, and before long, the story was spilling out of Maggie like water from a broken dam. War Dog to be put down after PTSD diagnosis would run on the evening broadcast, reaching 200,000 viewers across the Front Range. Michael Sterling watched the newscast from his seat in the VA clinic waiting room, surrounded by men and women who carried their own invisible scars. He'd come for his monthly disability review, a ritual of forms and questions that reminded him monthly how broken the government considered him to be. But when Jennifer Walsh's voice described Thunder's service record, 4 tours, 3 Bronze Stars, 2 handlers killed in action, something shifted behind Michael's sightless eyes. The panic attack hit him like an IED blast, sudden and devastating. His hands shook, his breathing became shallow gasps, and somewhere in the chaos of his mind he heard a sound that shouldn't exist, the distinctive bark of a German shepherd calling for backup. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the VA psychiatrist who'd been treating him for 3 years, had never seen him react so violently to a trigger. "Michael, you're safe. You're in Denver, not Syria. Can you tell me what you're feeling?" But Michael couldn't explain the inexplicable certainty that was building in his chest like a storm front. Against every rational thought, against the protest of his caseworker who reminded him he could barely afford groceries, he was going to Hope Valley. The 3-hour bus ride through mountain passes he couldn't see would drain his monthly budget, but something deeper than logic was driving him now. The thunderstorm that rolled in as his bus pulled into Hope Valley seemed like an omen, lightning splitting the sky and rain hammering the metal roof of the terminal. Michael stood under the inadequate shelter, his cheap umbrella turned inside out by the wind, and wondered what madness had brought him to a place he'd never been to save a dog he'd never met. He arrived at second chances as the storm reached its peak, his shoes squelching in the mud, his clothes plastered to his thin frame. Maggie watched from her kitchen window as he navigated the puddles with his white cane, something in his careful movements reminding her of soldiers she'd known, men who'd learned to find their way through minefields and worse. When she opened the door, his first words weren't about shelter or directions. "Ma'am, I'm here about the dog, the German shepherd." Water dripped from his beard, and his voice carried a certainty that defied his obvious exhaustion. "I know this sounds crazy, but I think I'm supposed to be here." Thunder, locked in his kennel 50 yards away, lifted his head for the first time in days. His ears swiveled toward the main building, and a sound escaped his throat. Not quite a whine, not quite a howl, but something that made every other animal in the sanctuary fall silent. It was the sound of recognition, of hope awakening after a long winter of despair. The morning after Michael's arrival brought an unexpected quiet to the sanctuary, as if the storm had washed away more than just the dust from the autumn leaves. Maggie found herself watching the blind veteran navigate the grounds with an ease that defied explanation, his white cane barely touching the ground as he moved toward Kennel 12 with the certainty of a man following a map burned into his memory. Thunder's transformation was immediate and unsettling. The dog that had cowered from every human approach for 6 months now pressed his massive frame against the chain-link fence, amber eyes locked on Michael's face with an intensity that made the other animals fall silent. When Michael spoke, simple words like "easy boy" and "I'm here now," Thunder responded with the precision of a soldier snapping to attention. "Doctor." Rebecca Hayes arrived early that morning to find Michael sitting cross-legged outside Thunder's kennel, speaking in low tones that seemed to bypass the dog's trauma entirely. "I've never seen anything like it," she confessed to Maggie, her clipboard forgotten as she watched Thunder actually eat for the first time in 4 days. "It's like watching a ghost recognize its own reflection." The mystery deepened when Michael unconsciously began using German commands. Platz for down, bleib for stay, higher for come, words he insisted he'd never learned. Thunder's responses were flawless, instantaneous, as if these commands were written in his DNA. When pressed about his linguistic abilities, Michael's face went blank, his hands trembling slightly as he touched his temples. "I don't speak German, ma'am. I barely passed high school Spanish." His voice carried the frustration of a man grappling with memories that felt both foreign and familiar. "But when I say those words, it's like remembering a song you heard in a dream." Becca's investigation began that afternoon, hunched over her laptop in the sanctuary's cramped office while Maggie fielded increasingly aggressive calls from County Animal Control. The VA's database showed Michael Sterling as a decorated Marine, medically discharged after traumatic brain injury sustained in an IED explosion near Damascus. But there were gaps in his service record, classified sections marked with warnings about national security implications. Her breakthrough came through an unexpected source, a veterinary forum where military working dog handlers shared stories and sought advice. A former Army canine trainer named Carlos Martinez responded to her carefully worded inquiry with information that made her hands shake as she typed. Operation Winter Storm, Syria, 2018. A joint military humanitarian mission that had gone catastrophically wrong, leaving multiple soldiers dead and classified details buried so deep that even mentioning the operation could trigger federal investigation. The arrival of Colonel David Morrison changed everything. He appeared at the sanctuary's gates like a storm front, his black SUV and federal credentials cutting through the small-town atmosphere like a blade. At 55, Morrison carried himself with the rigid bearing of a career officer who'd never learned to bend, his salt-and-pepper hair buzzed to regulation length, and his pale eyes holding the coldness of someone who'd made peace with difficult decisions. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm here about your German Shepherd." His voice was clipped, professional, but Maggie caught something darker underneath, a tremor that spoke of personal stakes beyond military protocol. "That animal is classified government property, incorrectly transferred to civilian custody. I have orders for immediate retrieval." Morrison's federal warrant bore impressive seals and intimidating language, but it was his reaction to Michael that revealed the true depth of the situation. When the blind veteran emerged from the kennel area, Thunder trotting calmly at his side, Morrison's military composure cracked for just an instant. His face went pale, and his hand moved unconsciously toward his sidearm before he caught himself. "Staff Sergeant Sterling." The rank came out like an accusation. "You were declared KIA 3 years ago. Your presence here complicates matters considerably." Michael's response was equally loaded with history. "Colonel Morrison." His voice carried no warmth, no military deference, just the flat acknowledgement of a subordinate who'd learned to distrust his superior. Funny how dead men keep turning up, isn't it? The confrontation that followed shattered any illusion of simple bureaucratic procedure. Morrison painted Michael as an unstable soldier who'd disobeyed direct orders during a civilian evacuation, abandoning his post and his K-9 partner to pursue an unauthorized rescue mission. "Some soldiers choose emotion over duty, Sergeant. They invariably end up dead, or worse, they get other soldiers killed." Michael's counter-narrative emerged in fragments, his damaged memory struggling against years of suppression. He spoke of Operation Winter Storm not as a humanitarian mission, but as something darker, a weapons transfer operation disguised as refugee aid. He remembered children caught in crossfire, civilians used as human shields, and orders that violated every principle he'd sworn to uphold. "Thunder and I were the only witnesses," Michael said, his hand resting on the dog's scarred head. "Funny how witnesses have a way of disappearing in your operations, Colonel." The town's response split along predictable lines. Veterans rallied around Michael and Thunder, their collective memory of betrayal and abandonment crystallizing around this living symbol of military sacrifice discarded. Local businessman Frank Kowalski, Brad's father and a Korean War veteran, organized an impromptu town hall meeting at the VFW post, his gravelly voice cutting through the tension. "We don't abandon our own. Not here, not ever." But practical voices raised uncomfortable questions. Thunder had attacked 3 handlers, and Michael's mental state remained questionable. The sanctuary was already bankrupt, and now they were harboring what amounted to classified government property. "It's just a dog," argued school board member Patricia Vance, her words echoing the cold pragmatism that kept small towns functioning. "Is it worth destroying our community over one animal?" As news vans descended on Hope Valley and social media exploded with #SaveThunder hashtags, the real stakes became clear. This wasn't just about a damaged dog and a blind veteran. It was about the stories we tell ourselves about honor, sacrifice, and the price of standing up to power. With 48 hours remaining before the federal deadline, the countdown had begun. The countdown clock that haunted Michael's nightmares wasn't digital. It was the steady rhythm of Thunder's heartbeat against his palm as they sat together in the pre-dawn darkness of Kennel 12. 24 hours remained before Colonel Morrison's federal deadline, and with each passing minute, Michael felt fragments of memory breaking through the carefully constructed walls in his mind like water through a cracking dam. The dreams had intensified since Thunder's arrival, fragmentary images that felt more real than his waking hours. Children's voices calling in Arabic, the acrid smell of burning diesel fuel, and always, Thunder's distinctive bark cutting through the chaos of battle. Michael would wake with his face wet with tears he couldn't remember shedding, his hands reaching for a rifle that hadn't been there for 3 years. Dr. Hayes found him that morning sitting with Thunder in the exercise yard, both of them motionless as sentinels. The dog's transformation continued to defy medical explanation. His coat had regained some of its luster, his appetite had returned, and the aggressive episodes had ceased entirely. But it was the way Thunder positioned himself that caught her veterinary eye, always between Michael and potential threats, always watching the perimeter, always ready to defend a man who couldn't see danger coming. "Michael," she said softly, not wanting to startle either of them, "I need to show you something I found." The documents she spread across Maggie's kitchen table told a story that official records had tried to erase. Operation Winter Storm, launched in October 2018, had been sold to Congress as a humanitarian mission to evacuate Syrian refugees from a contested border region. But the classified addenda painted a different picture. Arms transfers to questionable allies, civilian casualties dismissed as acceptable losses, and evidence of war profiteering that reached the highest levels of military command. Michael's hands shook as he traced the pages with his fingertips, his mind translating the bureaucratic language into memories that burned like acid. "We were supposed to extract 50 refugees," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the kitchen clock's ticking. "Morrison changed the mission parameters an hour before insertion. Suddenly we were providing security for a weapons convoy, and the refugees became expendable." The breaking point had come when their convoy was ambushed near a bombed-out school where families had taken shelter. Morrison's orders were clear: maintain position, protect the weapons, let the quick reaction force handle civilian casualties. But Michael and Thunder had heard children screaming in the basement, trapped under rubble as insurgent fire raked the building. "I made a choice," Michael said, his face etched with the weight of that decision. "Thunder and I went in. We got 17 kids out before the building collapsed. But Morrison?" His voice broke and Thunder whined softly, pressing closer against his legs. "Morrison reported us as KIA rather than face a court-martial for abandoning civilians. It was easier to bury the truth than explain why 2 soldiers disobeyed orders to save children's lives." Maggie's own crisis deepened as the sanctuary's financial situation reached critical mass. The power company had issued a final disconnect notice. The feed supplier demanded immediate payment for 2 months of overdue bills, and the bank had scheduled a foreclosure hearing for the following week. She sat at her desk, surrounded by the accumulated debris of a life spent caring for the unwanted, and wondered if she was finally being asked to sacrifice too much. Her late husband, Harold's Purple Heart, sat in its place of honor on the mantelpiece, a reminder of his own struggles with the moral injuries of war. He'd come home from Vietnam changed, haunted by decisions made in the crucible of combat, and had never fully found peace before the PTSD claimed him. Looking at Michael and Thunder, Maggie saw Harold's ghost in their shared trauma, the way they both carried wounds that couldn't be bandaged or medicated away. "The good Lord works in mysterious ways," she murmured to herself, a phrase that had carried her through her husband's suicide, her son's death in Afghanistan, and countless smaller tragedies. But faith felt fragile in the face of federal warrants and mounting debt, and for the first time in decades, Maggie wondered if some burdens were too heavy even for divine intervention. The town's division crystallized at the emergency meeting Pastor Williams called at Hope Valley Community Church. The sanctuary normally held 150 people, but tonight nearly 300 crowded into pews, folding chairs, and standing room along the walls. The American flag hung beside the Christian cross, both symbols bearing witness to a community wrestling with competing loyalties. Frank Kowalski spoke first, his weathered hands gripping the podium as he channeled 60 years of military brotherhood. "My unit left 3 men behind in Korea," he said, his voice steady despite his 81 years. "I've lived with that shame every day since. We don't get many chances to make things right, but this dog and this Marine, they're our chance." "We don't abandon our own." The veterans section erupted in support, men and women who understood the unspoken covenant between those who serve. Sarah Martinez, whose brother had returned from Iraq with PTSD, stood to add her voice. "If we can't save 1 dog and 1 soldier, what does that say about our promises to the hundreds who'll come after them?" But the opposition was equally passionate. School Superintendent Janet Briggs worried about setting dangerous precedents. I understand the emotional appeal, but we're talking about harboring what the federal government considers stolen property. What happens to our children's future when this community becomes known for defying lawful orders? Patricia Vance's words cut deeper. It's just a dog, a dangerous dog that's already attacked multiple people. How many of our children have to be at risk so we can feel good about ourselves? Her pragmatism found support among parents and business owners who feared the economic consequences of federal investigation. The debate grew heated as evening deepened, voices rising and tempers fraying along lines that had nothing to do with thunder and everything to do with competing visions of American values. When Morrison arrived with 2 federal marshals, the discussion ceased abruptly, replaced by the tense silence of a community holding its breath. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison said, his uniform impeccable despite the late hour, "I appreciate your passion, but this is a matter of national security, not local politics. The animal in question possesses classified training and has been exposed to sensitive operational details. His continued presence in civilian custody represents an unacceptable risk." Michael's response shattered the fragile composure he'd maintained for 3 days. Standing slowly, thunder rising with him, he faced Morrison across the crowded sanctuary with the dignity of a man who'd found his voice again. "Tell them about the children, Colonel. Tell them about the families we were ordered to leave behind while we guarded your weapons shipment." Morrison's face went rigid, but Michael continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "Tell them about the cover-up, about the missing after-action reports, about the soldiers who were declared dead rather than allowed to testify about war crimes. Tell them why you're really here, not to protect national security, but to silence the last witnesses to your failures." The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, visible to everyone but impossible to grasp. Morrison's denial was swift and absolute. "This man is mentally unstable, suffering from documented traumatic brain injury. His accusations are the product of a damaged mind seeking someone to blame for his own failures." But doubt had been planted, and Dr. Hayes stepped forward with evidence that changed everything. "Colonel Morrison, if Michael is mentally incompetent, how do you explain this?" She held up her phone, playing a recording of Michael giving complex tactical commands in German, Thunder responding with precision that spoke of years of joint training. "This isn't random behavior. This is muscle memory, preserved despite his supposed amnesia." Morrison's composure cracked slightly, his military bearing wavering as he realized his carefully constructed narrative was unraveling. "Whatever relationship may have existed between Sergeant Sterling and this animal is irrelevant. My orders are clear, and I will carry them out." The confrontation might have escalated further, but Thunder himself diffused the tension in a way that surprised everyone present. Rising from his position beside Michael, the German shepherd walked slowly to the center of the aisle, then sat with perfect military bearing, his amber eyes sweeping the crowd before settling on Morrison. He made no aggressive moves, showed no signs of the violence that had marked his earlier behavior. Instead, he simply waited, as if offering himself for judgment. It was Maggie who broke the silence, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading the hearts of wounded creatures. "Colonel, that dog just made his choice. He's not hiding, not fighting, not running away. He's saying he trusts this community to do what's right." She paused, her gaze sweeping the assembled faces. "The question is, do we trust ourselves?" The meeting ended without resolution, but lines had been drawn that couldn't be easily erased. As families filed out into the crisp autumn night, they carried with them the weight of a decision that would define their community for generations to come. In 18 hours, Morrison would return with federal authority to seize Thunder. Whether Hope Valley would stand with Michael and his dog, or step aside in the name of practical compromise remained to be seen. The final morning arrived with deceptive serenity, autumn sunlight filtering through golden aspens as if nature itself was unaware of the reckoning about to unfold. Michael woke before dawn in Maggie's guest room, his internal clock calibrated to military precision despite 3 years of civilian life. Thunder lay beside the bed, amber eyes already alert, watching his handler with the patient intensity of a soldier awaiting orders. 6 hours remained before Morrison's deadline. The sanctuary buzzed with nervous energy as volunteers arrived in unprecedented numbers. Frank Kowalski had organized what he called a peaceful demonstration of community values, though the grim faces and tense postures suggested everyone understood they were preparing for something closer to a siege. Veterans formed the core of the gathering, but they were joined by teachers, shop owners, retirees, and families who'd decided that some principles were worth defending. Maggie moved through the crowd with coffee and determination, her silver hair catching the morning light as she coordinated what might be her sanctuary's final day. The foreclosure papers sat unsigned on her kitchen table, but financial ruin seemed almost trivial compared to the moral crisis unfolding in her front yard. "The good Lord works in mysterious ways," she murmured to Pastor Williams as they watched the growing crowd, "but sometimes he asks us to be his hands and feet in this world." Dr. Hayes worked frantically in her clinic, knowing that whatever happened today, Thunder would need medical attention. The dog's transformation over the past week had been remarkable, but she could see the stress building in his body language. The way his ears swiveled toward every new sound, how his muscles remained coiled despite his outward calm. PTSD didn't disappear overnight, even with the healing presence of a beloved handler. Morrison arrived precisely at noon with a convoy that announced federal authority with bureaucratic efficiency. 3 black SUVs, 2 federal marshals, and a veterinarian from Fort Carson who carried a tranquilizer gun with the casual competence of someone accustomed to handling dangerous animals. The colonel emerged from the lead vehicle in full dress uniform, his chest decorated with ribbons that spoke of a distinguished career built on following orders without question. "Mrs. Wilson," Morrison called across the gathering crowd, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "I'm here to execute Federal Warrant 47 Alpha 9 for the seizure of classified military property. I trust there will be no interference with lawful federal action." The crowd shifted uneasily, but nobody moved away. Michael stood at the sanctuary's gate with Thunder at his side, both of them displaying the calm readiness of soldiers who'd accepted their fate. The blind veteran wore his dress blues for the first time since his medical discharge, the uniform hanging loose on his diminished frame but still carrying the dignity of service. "Colonel Morrison," Michael said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, "before you take Thunder, the people of this community deserve to hear the truth about Operation Winter Storm. They deserve to know why you're really here." Morrison's jaw tightened, but he maintained his professional composure. "Sergeant Sterling, you are not mentally competent to make accusations against senior military personnel. Your brain injury—" "My brain injury was a convenient fiction," Michael interrupted, his words cutting through Morrison's practiced deflection like a blade. "Just like my death certificate, just like the classified burial of everything that happened in Syria. The only injury I suffered was learning what happens to soldiers who put conscience before orders." The revelation rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. Dr. Hayes stepped forward with a manila folder thick with medical records and witness statements she'd gathered through veterinary networks and military contacts. "Colonel Morrison, if Michael is incompetent, how do you explain the neurological assessments showing his cognitive function is entirely normal? How do you explain the classified communications intercepts that prove Operation Winter Storm was an arms-dealing operation disguised as humanitarian aid?" Morrison's military bearing wavered for the first time, his pale eyes darting toward the news cameras that had appeared as if summoned by the controversy. "Dr. Hayes, you are interfering with a classified federal investigation. Those documents are copies," Becca finished firmly. "The originals are already in the hands of the Senate Intelligence Committee and the Department of Defense Inspector General. The truth is going to come out, Colonel. The only question is whether you're remembered as the officer who covered up war crimes or the one who finally did the right thing." The standoff intensified as Morrison signaled his marshals to advance. But Thunder, reading the tension with a soldier's instincts, moved to interpose himself between the federal agents and Michael. The dog made no aggressive moves. He simply stood with military bearing, his scarred body a living testament to the cost of loyal service. Frank Kowalski stepped forward from the crowd, his 81-year-old frame still carrying the authority of a master sergeant who'd led men in combat. "Colonel, I've been watching soldiers for 60 years, and I know the difference between duty and tyranny. This dog served our country with honor." This Marine exposed war crimes at the cost of his career and his identity. If you want to destroy them, you'll have to go through every veteran in this town. The crowd moved as one, a wall of community solidarity that included teachers, parents, business owners, and retirees who'd decided that some fights were worth having. Sheriff's Deputy Maria Santos stepped forward, her hand resting on her service weapon, not in threat but in preparation. "Colonel Morrison, I'm going to need to see your warrant executed through proper local channels. Federal authority doesn't supersede constitutional protections in my jurisdiction." Morrison's composure finally cracked, revealing the desperate man beneath the military facade. "You people don't understand what's at stake here. Operation Winter Storm involved weapons transfers that are still classified at the highest levels. If details become public, it could compromise ongoing operations, expose intelligence assets, cost American lives. Like the Syrian children we were ordered to abandon?" Michael's voice carried a quiet fury that made everyone present feel the weight of moral injury. "Like the families who died because protecting weapons shipments was more important than protecting civilians? How many American lives is your cover-up really saving, Colonel?" The breaking point came when Morrison drew his sidearm, not pointing it directly at anyone but making his intentions clear. "I have lawful orders, and I will carry them out. Stand aside or face federal charges for interfering with military operations." Thunder's response was immediate and precise. The German Shepherd moved with fluid grace, placing himself directly between Morrison's weapon and Michael, his body low and ready, but showing no aggression. He simply stood guard, amber eyes locked on Morrison's face with the steady gaze of a soldier who'd faced death before and found it wanting. "Shoot the dog," Morrison ordered the Fort Carson veterinarian, but Dr. Patricia Hendricks shook her head slowly. "Sir, that animal is displaying protective behavior, not aggression. He hasn't threatened anyone, and I won't euthanize a healthy dog for following his training." She set down the tranquilizer gun with deliberate care. "My oath is to preserve life, not destroy it for political convenience." The moment hung suspended like a held breath, federal authority facing community resolve across a gulf of competing values. Morrison's radio crackled with urgent communications from his superiors, pressure building from Washington as news coverage expanded beyond local media. The hashtag #SaveThunder was trending nationally, and congressional offices were fielding thousands of calls demanding answers about Operation Winter Storm. Pastor Williams stepped forward, his voice carrying the moral authority of someone who'd spent decades counseling the wounded. "Colonel Morrison, I don't know what demons you're fighting, but destroying an innocent animal won't lay them to rest. Some wounds can only be healed by doing what's right, not what's ordered." Morrison's hand shook as he maintained his grip on the sidearm, years of rigid military discipline warring against a growing recognition that his carefully constructed justifications were crumbling. The crowd watched in tense silence as a career officer confronted the gap between the soldier he'd been trained to be and the man he'd become. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but Thunder himself provided the resolution. Rising from his protective crouch, the German shepherd walked slowly toward Morrison, stopping just beyond arm's reach. He sat with perfect military bearing, amber eyes reflecting not fear or aggression, but something that looked remarkably like forgiveness. It was Michael who spoke the words that broke the impasse. "Colonel, Thunder's offering you the same choice he offered me, the chance to remember what it means to serve with honor instead of fear." The shot echoed across Hope Valley like the crack of doom, silencing birds and freezing every heart in the crowd. Morrison's sidearms smoked in the autumn air as Thunder collapsed to the gravel, amber eyes wide with shock and pain, dark blood pooling beneath his chest. The German shepherd tried to rise, his legs scrambling against the earth with the desperate instinct of a soldier refusing to stay down, but his strength ebbed with each labored breath. Michael's scream tore through the silence, a sound of anguish so raw it seemed to strip away every pretense of dignity and control. He dropped to his knees beside Thunder, his hands finding the warm, wet fur as his world collapsed into the space between heartbeats. "No, no, no," he whispered, his voice breaking into fragments. "Thunder, stay with me, boy. Don't you leave me again." The crowd erupted in chaos. Veterans surged forward with barely controlled rage. Mothers clutched their children, and Pastor Williams fell to his knees in prayer. Dr. Hayes sprinted from her clinic with a medical bag, her face pale with professional determination masking personal horror. Maggie stood frozen, one weathered hand pressed to her mouth as 67 years of accumulated loss threatened to overwhelm her faith. Morrison holstered his weapon with mechanical precision, his face a mask of military composure that couldn't quite hide the tremor in his hands. "The classified asset has been neutralized according to Federal Directive 47 Alpha 9, he announced to no one in particular, his voice hollow as an empty shell casing. "The matter is closed." But as Dr. Hayes knelt beside Thunder, her skilled hands working to stem the bleeding, she made a discovery that changed everything. "The bullet missed his heart by inches," she called out, her voice cutting through the chaos. "He's alive." Critical, but alive. The wound, while serious, had struck high in the shoulder, causing massive blood loss but avoiding vital organs. Frank Kowalski's voice rose above the crowd like a battle cry. "Call life flight! Get every EMT in the county here now!" But even as the emergency response mobilized, everyone could see Thunder weakening, his breathing growing shallow as shock set in. The dog's amber eyes found Michael's face, and in that gaze was a lifetime of loyalty, devotion, and forgiveness that transcended words. Meanwhile, another tragedy was unfolding at Mercy General Hospital 40 miles away. Maggie had collapsed shortly after Thunder was shot, her weakened heart unable to process another devastating loss. The paramedics worked frantically as her pulse grew thready and her breathing became labored. I can't lose another one," she whispered to Dr. Martinez as the oxygen mask covered her face. Harold, Tommy, and now this. How much can one heart take? The sanctuary animals seemed to sense the crisis enveloping their world. Dogs howled in their kennels, cats paced restlessly, and even the usually placid horses showed signs of distress. It was as if the very foundation of their refuge was cracking beneath the weight of human cruelty and institutional indifference. Michael remained with Thunder as the life flight helicopter descended, his uniform stained with blood and his face wet with tears he no longer tried to hide. "I should have protected you," he whispered into Thunder's ear, his voice barely audible over the rotor wash. "I should have found a way to keep you safe." The dog's tail moved once, a faint acknowledgment that required tremendous effort, but conveyed forgiveness beyond measure. Morrison watched the medical evacuation with growing unease, his carefully constructed justifications beginning to crumble as the reality of his actions sank in. The federal marshals who'd accompanied him exchanged uncomfortable glances, their law enforcement instincts rebelling against what felt more like an execution than a lawful seizure. When Deputy Santos stepped forward with handcuffs, Morrison didn't resist. "Colonel David Morrison, you're under arrest for animal cruelty, reckless endangerment, and discharging a firearm within city limits," she announced, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. "You have the right to remain silent." The irony was bitter and complete. Federal authority that had seemed absolute moments before now faced local jurisdiction exercising constitutional protections Morrison himself had sworn to defend. His radio crackled with increasingly urgent demands from Washington for status reports, but Morrison found himself unable to explain how a simple asset seizure had become a public relations disaster of epic proportions. As Thunder was loaded onto the helicopter, his condition deteriorating rapidly, Dr. Hayes made a desperate decision. "I'm going with him," she announced, grabbing her emergency kit. "If we're going to save him, we need every minute." She climbed into the aircraft beside the dog who'd become a symbol of everything worth fighting for, her hands already working to stabilize his vital signs. The helicopter disappeared into the Colorado sky, carrying with it Hope Valley's last best hope for redemption. Michael stood in the settling dust, supported by Frank Kowalski and Pastor Williams, his world reduced to the blood-stained gravel at his feet and the fading sound of rotors. The federal convoy prepared to depart, their mission technically complete, but morally bankrupt. News crews captured every moment of the tragedy, broadcasting images that would haunt viewers across the nation: a blind veteran weeping over his wounded dog, an elderly woman suffering heart failure from grief, a small town's faith shattered by institutional betrayal. The hashtag #SaveThunder evolved into #JusticeForThunder, amplifying outrage that reached congressional offices and Pentagon briefing rooms. But perhaps the cruelest irony was yet to be revealed. As federal investigators began examining Morrison's operation, they discovered that Operation Winter Storm's classified status had been manufactured to hide not national security secrets, but evidence of Morrison's personal corruption. The weapons transfers he'd protected had lined his own pockets, and the Syrian civilians Michael and Thunder had tried to save had died to preserve Morrison's criminal enterprise. The small town that had awakened that morning with hope for justice now faced the stark reality that doing the right thing sometimes came at a price too terrible to bear. As Thunder fought for his life in Denver Trauma Center and Maggie struggled in a cardiac care unit, the community that had rallied around them wondered if their stand had been noble defiance or tragic futility. Michael sat in the sanctuary's empty office as evening fell, his uniform still stained with Thunder's blood, listening to reports from the hospital that offered no comfort. Critical condition, touch and go, massive blood loss. The clinical terminology couldn't capture the reality that his world was dying one heartbeat at a time, 40 miles away in a sterile room where love meant nothing and machines measured what remained of hope. Outside, the autumn wind rattled empty kennels and scattered leaves like abandoned promises. The foreclosure notice remained unsigned on Maggie's desk, but financial concerns seemed trivial now. Hope Valley had learned the cost of standing up to power, and the lesson was written in blood and broken hearts beneath an indifferent sky. The reversal began not with fanfare, but with a single phone call that shattered the silence of the sanctuary's emergency command center at 3:17 a.m. Dr. Hayes's voice crackled through the static, exhausted but alive with something that had been missing for hours: hope. "Michael, Thunder's stable. He's going to make it." But even as the first wave of relief washed over the assembled volunteers who'd maintained vigil through the night, a second call brought news that changed everything. Federal Judge Patricia Harrison, a stern woman in her 60s who'd been awakened by calls from Senator Elizabeth Warren's office, was issuing an emergency injunction based on evidence that had surfaced in the chaos following Morrison's arrest. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced over the conference call that included Michael, Pastor Williams, and Frank Kowalski, "new evidence has come to light that fundamentally alters the legal landscape of this case." Colonel Morrison's authority to act was based on falsified documents and fabricated national security claims. The evidence had emerged from an unexpected source, Morrison's own deputy, Major Sarah Chen, a career military lawyer who'd been growing increasingly uncomfortable with her superior's methods. When the shooting sparked a Department of Defense Inspector General investigation, Chen had provided investigators with recordings, financial documents, and operational reports that painted Morrison not as a patriotic officer protecting national security, but as a career criminal who'd used his position to orchestrate elaborate cover-ups. Operation Winter Storm, according to Chen's evidence, had been Morrison's personal arms-dealing operation from the beginning. The humanitarian mission narrative was pure fabrication, designed to provide cover for weapons transfers to Syrian militias who paid premium prices for American military hardware. When Michael and Thunder had stumbled onto civilian casualties caused by Morrison's militia clients, they'd become witnesses to war crimes that could destroy not just Morrison's career, but expose a network of corruption reaching into the highest levels of military procurement. The Syrian children Staff Sergeant Sterling saved weren't just caught in crossfire, Judge Harrison continued, her voice heavy with the weight of institutional betrayal. They were being used as human shields by Morrison's militia clients. Sterling's actions didn't just save 17 lives, they exposed a conspiracy that had already cost hundreds of innocent lives. Michael sat in stunned silence as the full scope of Morrison's deception became clear. His death hadn't been about protecting classified operations. It had been about silencing the only witness who could connect Morrison to the systematic murder of Syrian families. Thunder's classification as a dangerous asset hadn't been about his training. It had been about eliminating the one piece of evidence that could corroborate Michael's testimony. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Dr. Hayes, calling from Denver Presbyterian Hospital where Thunder was recovering, had discovered something during her review of the dog's medical records that made her hands shake as she read the veterinary files aloud. "Michael, Thunder wasn't just your canine partner in Syria. According to these genetic markers and breeding records, he's the son of Rex, your family's German Shepherd who died when you were 12. The connection hit Michael like physical blow, memories flooding back with crystalline clarity for the first time in 3 years. Rex had been his childhood companion, the dog who'd helped him survive his father's death and his mother's subsequent abandonment. When Rex died of cancer, 12-year-old Michael had sworn he'd never love another dog that completely again. But Rex's bloodline had continued through military breeding programs. And Thunder carried not just his father's genetics but his capacity for absolute loyalty. "That's why he recognized you," Dr. Hayes continued, her voice wonder-struck. "It wasn't just training or memory. It was something deeper. Genetic recognition, ancestral bonding that transcended conscious thought. Thunder knew you before he met you, the same way you knew him before you remembered him." Meanwhile, Morrison's world collapsed with the methodical precision of a controlled demolition. Federal investigators, armed with Chen's evidence and empowered by congressional outrage, began unraveling 3 years of carefully concealed corruption. Bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, weapons shipments to designated terrorist organizations, the murders of Syrian civilians who'd tried to expose the operation, each revelation painted Morrison not as a patriotic officer, but as a war criminal who'd used the American military as his personal criminal enterprise. The man who'd arrived in Hope Valley with federal authority and moral certainty now sat in a Denver holding cell, watching his carefully constructed life crumble on national television. His son's death in Afghanistan, the tragedy that had supposedly motivated his hardline stance against emotional decisions in warfare, was revealed to be another fabrication. Morrison had never had a son. He'd stolen the identity of a fallen soldier to create a sympathetic backstory for his war crimes. David Morrison isn't even his real name, Major Chen revealed in a Pentagon briefing that was broadcast live. He's actually David Kowalski, dishonorably discharged from the Army in 1995 for theft and fraud. He's been operating under false identity for over 20 years, using forged documents and stolen credentials to climb the military hierarchy. The revelation that Morrison was Frank Kowalski's disgraced nephew added another layer of betrayal to Hope Valley's trauma. The old veteran who'd led the community's defense of Thunder had unknowingly been fighting his own family's legacy of dishonor. When the news broke, Frank sat in his kitchen with tears streaming down his weathered face, understanding finally why Morrison's eyes had seemed familiar. "I threw him out 30 years ago for stealing from his grandmother," Frank confessed to Pastor Williams. "He was just a punk kid then, but I should have known he'd grown into something worse." The weight of familial shame added another dimension to the community's processing of recent events, but also provided a form of closure that helped heal some of the trauma. As Morrison's true identity and extensive criminal history became public, federal prosecutors found themselves with a case that stretched far beyond Hope Valley. The fake colonel had been involved in arms-dealing operations across 3 continents, human trafficking networks in Eastern Europe, and financial fraud that had cost taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars. His arrest triggered a cascade of investigations that would ultimately expose one of the largest military corruption scandals in American history. But for Michael, sitting beside Thunder's hospital bed as the German Shepherd slowly recovered from surgery, the larger implications seemed distant compared to the simple miracle of watching his partner's chest rise and fall with steady breathing. Thunder's amber eyes, though dulled by medication, held the same infinite loyalty that had sustained them both through 3 years of separation and trauma. "I remember everything now," Michael whispered, his hand resting gently on Thunder's bandaged shoulder. "I remember Rex. I remember you as a puppy in training. I remember every mission we ran together. But most of all, I remember making you a promise that we'd always come home together. I'm sorry it took so long to keep that promise." Dr. Hayes, exhausted from 36 hours of continuous surgery and crisis management, watched the reunion with professional satisfaction and personal wonder. "The bullet missed his heart by 2 inches, she reported to the gathering crowd of supporters. "Another millimeter to the left and we would have lost him. But German Shepherds are tough, and this one has more reason to live than most." The physical healing would take months, but the emotional and spiritual healing had already begun. Thunder's tail wagged weakly when he heard Michael's voice, and his breathing seemed to strengthen when his handler spoke. The bond that had survived gunfire, explosions, forced separation, and institutional betrayal remained unbroken, a testament to the power of love to transcend even the most determined efforts to destroy it. As dawn broke over Denver, painting the hospital windows gold with morning light, Michael felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, genuine hope for the future. Thunder would recover, Morrison would face justice, and the truth about Operation Winter Storm would finally be told. But more than that, he was no longer alone in a world that had tried to erase his existence. He had his partner back, and together they could face whatever came next. The reversal was complete, but the real story was just beginning. 6 months later, Hope Valley wore its transformation like a badge of honor, the autumn aspens giving way to snow-laden evergreens that sparkled in the crystalline air of a Colorado winter. The Second Chances Animal Sanctuary had been rebuilt and expanded with federal compensation funds, but more importantly, it had been reborn with a purpose that extended far beyond its original mission. The new sign at the entrance read, "Thunder's Haven, where heroes heal," and beneath it, a bronze plaque bore the simple inscription, "In memory of all who serve, and in honor of those who refuse to abandon hope." Michael Sterling stood in the center of the main training yard, his partial vision restored through months of therapy and the miraculous healing that comes when psychological wounds finally begin to close. He could see well enough now to watch Thunder demonstrate basic commands to a group of young veterans, the German Shepherd's movements fluid and confident despite the slight limp that would always remind them of that terrible day. The scar across Thunder's shoulder had healed into a silver line that caught the sunlight, a mark of survival rather than suffering. "Platz," Michael called softly, and Thunder dropped into position with the precision of a soldier who'd never forgotten his training. But there was something different now. A lightness in the dog's posture, a peace in his amber eyes that spoke of battles won and purposes fulfilled. The PTSD that had made him dangerous for 6 months had faded like morning mist, replaced by the calm confidence of a working dog who'd found his calling again. The sanctuary now housed 63 animals and served as a model for veteran animal therapy programs across the nation. Dr. Rebecca Hayes Sterling, she'd taken Michael's name in a ceremony that brought tears to hardened veterans' eyes, oversaw the medical aspects of what had become a revolutionary approach to treating combat trauma. Her research on the healing bond between wounded soldiers and rescued animals was being studied at universities nationwide, but the real proof was in the faces of the men and women who found their way to Thunder's Haven. Maggie Chen Wilson, now 78 and walking with a slight shuffle that betrayed her heart attack 6 months earlier, moved through the facility with the quiet authority of someone who'd survived her own resurrection. Her near-death experience had left her with an even deeper faith and an unshakable belief that every creature deserved a second chance. She'd married William "Bill" Martinez the previous spring, a fellow veteran who'd lost his wife to cancer, and found in Maggie a kindred spirit who understood the weight of accumulated grief. "Well, I'll be hornswoggled," she said to Michael as they watched Thunder work with Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez, a young Marine who'd lost both legs to an IED in Afghanistan. "That dog's got more sense than most therapists. Look how he's positioning himself so she can use him for balance while she works with her prosthetics." The transformation extended beyond the sanctuary to the town itself. Hope Valley had become a destination for military families, veterans organizations, and therapy programs that brought steady tourism revenue and national attention. The annual Thunder Days Festival drew thousands of visitors each September, raising funds for veteran services and animal rescue operations across the country. Property values had increased, new businesses had opened, and the community had discovered that doing the right thing could sometimes yield unexpected dividends. But the most profound changes were personal ones, measured in healing hearts and restored hope rather than economic statistics. Michael and Rebecca's wedding at the sanctuary had been a celebration of second chances, with Thunder serving as best dog in a custom-made vest that bore his Medal of Honor, the first ever awarded to a military working dog. Pastor Williams had officiated, his words about love conquering fear and truth overcoming deception resonating across a crowd that included everyone from congressional representatives to the children Thunder now worked with in the therapy program. Their first child was due in the spring, and Thunder had already appointed himself as the baby's protector, sleeping beside the crib that Bill Martinez had built by hand in their small house overlooking the sanctuary. Rebecca's pregnancy had been smooth, blessed by the kind of peace that comes when life finally makes sense, when purpose and love align in ways that seem almost too good to be true. Frank Kowalski, now 82, had found his own redemption in helping to expose his nephew's crimes and ensuring that every veteran who'd been harmed by Morrison's corruption received proper compensation and care. He spent his days at the sanctuary, sharing stories with younger veterans and teaching them that shame could be transformed into strength when channeled toward helping others. His weekly coffee sessions with Michael had become legendary among the staff, two generations of warriors finding common ground in their shared commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The legal aftermath of Morrison's arrest had exceeded everyone's expectations. The man who'd posed as Colonel David Morrison received 35 years in federal prison for war crimes, fraud, arms dealing, and a dozen other charges that painted him as one of the most corrupt figures in modern military history. His conviction had triggered reforms throughout the Department of Defense, new oversight mechanisms designed to prevent the kind of systematic abuse that had nearly destroyed Michael and Thunder. But perhaps more importantly, Morrison's downfall had led to the passage of Thunder's Law, federal legislation that provided legal protections for military working dogs and mandated proper retirement care for animals who'd served their country. The law established a national registry of military working dogs, guaranteed medical care for service-related injuries, and created a network of approved retirement facilities where these heroes could live out their days with dignity. The children's program at Thunder's Haven had become Rebecca's special passion, watching as traumatized kids who'd struggled with traditional therapy found healing through their relationships with rescued animals. 7-year-old Emma Martinez, Bill's granddaughter, had been selectively mute since her father's death in Iraq, but she'd spoken her first words in 2 years while brushing Thunder's coat. Good dog, brave dog, safe dog. Thunder's offspring were now serving in K-9 units across the military, each puppy carrying not just superior genetics, but the legacy of a dog who'd proven that loyalty and love could overcome even the most determined efforts to destroy them. The breeding program that Rebecca oversaw was producing a new generation of military working dogs. But more than that, it was continuing a bloodline that connected back to Rex, to Michael's childhood, to the fundamental truth that some bonds transcend individual lives. The media attention had eventually faded, but not before Thunder's story had inspired a dozen books, a major motion picture, and countless social media tributes that kept the message alive, that heroes come in all forms, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of it, and that love really can conquer institutional evil when ordinary people decide to take extraordinary stands. On this particular evening, as winter's early darkness settled over the mountains, Michael found himself in the place where it had all begun. Kennel 12, now converted into Thunder's personal quarters, but maintained as a reminder of how far they'd traveled together. Thunder lay on his custom orthopedic bed, amber eyes peaceful as they watched the snow fall outside the window. "You know what I learned from all this, boy?" Michael said, his voice soft with the contentment of a man who'd found his way home. "I learned that sometimes the very thing we think we're saving ends up saving us instead. I thought I was rescuing you from being put down, but really, you were rescuing me from being dead inside." Thunder's tail thumped once against his bed, a sound that had become as familiar and comforting as his own heartbeat. The dog, who'd waited 6 months for his handler to remember him, had taught an entire community about the power of persistence, the value of loyalty, and the truth that love doesn't require memory. It just requires an open heart. Rebecca joined them in the quiet space, her hand resting on the gentle swell that carried their future, their hope made manifest. I've been thinking about names, she said, settling beside Michael on the bench that faced Thunder's area. For a boy, maybe Rex. To honor the legacy? Michael smiled, his hand covering hers as Thunder rose and padded over to rest his great head against Rebecca's knee, somehow understanding that he was guardian not just to them, but to the new life they carried. Rex Sterling, he said, testing the sound. I like it. Rex Sterling, son of heroes. As if summoned by the moment's perfection, Maggie appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of her famous hot chocolate, her eyes bright with the joy of someone who'd lived long enough to see miracles become reality. The good Lord works in mysterious ways, she said, her standard phrase now carrying the weight of lived experience. Sometimes he sends us broken things so we can learn how to heal ourselves. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Hope Valley in pristine white that seemed to promise new beginnings and fresh starts. The sanctuary settled into its evening routine, 63 rescued animals secure in the knowledge that they were safe, wanted, and loved. In the distance, the lights of town twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing a family that had chosen courage over comfort, community over convenience. Thunder's story had become legend, but the dog himself remained exactly what he'd always been, a loyal companion who'd found his way home through love, patience, and the unshakable belief that some bonds are too strong for time, trauma, or human cruelty to break. As he settled back onto his bed, surrounded by the quiet contentment of his chosen family, Thunder embodied the simple truth that had sustained him through 6 months of waiting and a lifetime of service. That home isn't a place, it's the people who refuse to give up on you. The last sound in Kennel 12 that night was Thunder's gentle snore, the peaceful breathing of a warrior at rest, finally and forever safe in the knowledge that he would never again be abandoned, never again be forgotten, never again be forced to wait alone for love to find its way back to him. In the end, Thunder's story wasn't about a dog at all. It was about the transformative power of refusing to abandon hope, the healing that comes when communities choose compassion over convenience, and the simple truth that sometimes the greatest heroes walk on 4 legs and speak without words. It was a story about coming home, not to a place, but to a purpose, not to a building, but to a bond that transcends understanding and makes all things possible. Love doesn't have a voice, but it has a heartbeat. And in Hope Valley, Colorado, that heartbeat would continue for generations to come, a steady rhythm of hope that would guide other lost souls home to where they belonged. Dear friends, Thunder's story isn't just about a dog and his Marine. It's about every one of us who's ever felt forgotten, abandoned, or told we're too old to matter anymore. Like Thunder waiting 6 months in that kennel, many of us have experienced the crushing loneliness of feeling invisible in a world that values youth over wisdom, efficiency over loyalty. But here's what Thunder teaches us. It's never too late for a second chance, never too late to find purpose, never too late to matter deeply to someone who needs exactly what we have to offer. Maggie was 67 when she risked everything to save one dog, proving that our greatest contributions often come not despite our age, but because of it. We've lived long enough to know what truly matters, not success or status, but love, loyalty, and the courage to stand up for what's right. Thunder waited patiently because he understood something profound. The best things in life are worth waiting for, and love always finds its way home. Your story isn't over. It's just beginning its most meaningful chapter. What thunder in your life are you still waiting to save or be saved by? Have you ever had a moment when standing up for something small led to something life-changing? Share your story below. This community believes every voice matters.